All right, this is the review video for the quiz for fundamentals class. Of course, we missed this quiz last week, and so we are doing it this week. And this simply covers the area where we talked about the resurrection of Christ. All right, and spent quite a bit of time on that. All right, and so anyway. Let me tell you first of all the kinds of questions. I'm going to tell you this might be a little bit more difficult of a quiz. All right, the quiz has mostly short answer questions. All right, so you got to kind of know it. There are some true and false questions as well, and then 2 essay questions. All right, so it is a little bit more of a difficult quiz, so I hope you will watch the video a few times and really prepare for this one. All right, let me go over some of the information that will be on this quiz so you get a good idea. Of course, we mentioned the doctrine of the resurrection is mentioned 104 times in the New Testament. All right, it was a very important doctrine. In fact, what's the point of the crucifixion if there is no resurrection? The crucifixion loses its meaning without the resurrection. We mentioned several different internal proofs of the gospel, and we talked about the fact that the gospels are 4 independent accounts. And we mentioned that there are too many supposed discrepancies to have been made by collusion. If the 4 writers of the Gospels were colluding, of course, they would not have had what looks like discrepancies, all right? Of course, they're not discrepancies, but they wrote it that way, all right? We also mentioned the fact that there's too much harmony between all 4 for them to have been made really independently, all right? And so the point is that they are very much alike, and yet there seems to be differences that aren't really differences. And it really goes to prove that these were 4 independent accounts, all right, but made under the hand of God, all right? We mentioned the fact that the writers were very straightforward in how they wrote the Gospels. There was no attempt to color, all right, the message or make it seem better than what it was. The writers of the Gospels did not appear to reflect on the meanings of what they were actually writing when they wrote it, all right, or any of the facts. They didn't sit there and think about it and say, well, maybe I should write it this way to make it more receivable. They didn't seem to do any of that. We mentioned several things, several different facts in the gospel stories that kind of show that. Of course, we mentioned the fact that Christ did not ever appear to any of his enemies. Now, if they were trying to make it look like, Jesus had resurrected, if they were trying to collude with that story, they would have had him appear to Pilate and Herod and so forth. But the gospel message, the Gospels don't record of him appearing to any of the enemies. We mentioned several other things, of course. The fact that Jesus told Mary not to touch him. And yet, the book of John doesn't really explain why, all right, so much. But later on, we see the other Gospels, the other women meet Jesus, and they do touch him. Of course, that happened at a later time. We mentioned, of course, that John outran Peter, and really doesn't talk much about, the reasoning behind that. Of course, Peter was the one that entered the tomb first. And, of course, we mentioned the fact that they examined the tomb. They found the napkin folded up, all right, and put to the side. And, of course, we mentioned that is symbolic in the Jewish tradition. When you fold the napkin and put it to the side, it means the master is coming back. And, of course, that was a picture, that was a sign that Jesus was sending to them. Of course, when the women are told by the angels to go back and tell the disciples, we mentioned the fact that they specifically told Peter, said, make sure you tell Peter. And of course, we know that Peter went back to the tomb twice. And of course, he went first with John and then later on went back by himself. All right. We mentioned when Mary went to the tomb, by the way, and saw Jesus the first time. Of course, he said, don't touch me. But initially, Mary didn't know who he was. She thought he was the gardener. And it was when Jesus said her name, that's when she knew who he was. It is interesting that the disciples that Jesus met, most of them did not recognize him to the beginning, which is one of the things that if they were colluding, they would have said they recognized him right away. But that's not the way it was. We talked about the 2 men on the road to Emmaus. They did not know it was Jesus until he broke the bread and prayed over it. That's when they recognized him as Jesus. We mentioned as well circumstantial evidence for the resurrection of Christ. Of course, we mentioned the fact that the apostles preached the resurrection as a foundational truth of the belief system. The resurrection is the very foundation of our belief system. Of course, we mentioned the fact that men do not lay down their lives for something they don't firmly believe in. And really, that's kind of what makes the whole idea of the theft lie stupid, all right? If the apostles stole the body, they would not have died, for that lie, all right? They would have known that they stole it. They wouldn't have died for it, all right? We also mentioned, of course, the stupidity of the theft lie. The soldier said the disciples stole his body while we slept. Sleeping sentries make poor eyewitnesses, all right? We mentioned as well some of the circumstantial evidence. Of course, we talked about the blood and water coming out, which show us that Jesus died of a heart attack or a broken heart. He did not die by asphyxiation or suffocation. We talked about several of the theories that people have tried to come up with to explain away the resurrection. Of course, we talked about the swoon theory, the idea that Jesus passed out on the cross and was resuscitated in the tomb. Of course, we said several things make that kind of stupid. Obviously, he had severe damage during the crucifixion. Really no record of anybody ever surviving a crucifixion. We mentioned the fact that the enemies of Christ made sure that he was dead. All right. The soldier pierced him in the side. If Jesus had appeared to his disciples the way he was, all right, they would not have been excited about his resurrection, all right? He would have looked like a physical wreck. We mentioned as well that the disciples would have known Jesus didn't resurrect if that's what he did. And so, of course, they wouldn't have died for him as well. All right? And really, where and when did he die? If, in fact, he didn't die on the cross, all right? We mentioned the wrong tomb theory, and, of course, the idea the women went to the wrong tomb. Of course, Joseph knew where his tomb was. Nicodemus knew where the tomb was. The priests knew where the tomb was. And, by the way, the ladies had been to the tomb before. They watched him be buried, all right? We mentioned the twin theory, of course, that Jesus had a twin that took over for him, all right? Obviously, Mary would have known if there was somebody that was acting like Jesus, the 12 disciples as well. The hallucination theory, the idea that 500 people were hallucinating at the same time, doesn't seem to make sense. We mentioned that Jesus did appear to several different people, and one of the people he appeared to was 7 disciples out fishing. And of course, Jesus had that conversation with Peter, where he said to Peter, "Lovest thou me more than these?" And we talked about that interaction back and forth. Jesus said twice to Peter, "Do you agape me?" Use that word agape. Peter responded by saying, "I phileo you." And we mentioned the third time, of course, Jesus changed words, and he said, "Do you phileo me?" And that caused Peter to be grieved, all right? We mentioned as well, we talked quite a bit about the resurrection and crucifixion, and we talked about the order of events of the resurrection. And I spent a lot of time going through it. And so here are the order of events. Think about it. First of all, Mary comes to the tomb. John chapter 20, verse 1. She sees the stone rolled away, doesn't look in, doesn't see angels, doesn't see Jesus, immediately runs to Peter and John, tells them that somebody's taken they moved the body. Peter and John go to the tomb. They investigate. They don't see any Jesus. They don't see any angels, and they go home. Mary Magdalene stays there, looks inside the tomb, sees 2 angels there. They begin to talk to her, and then a man appears behind her, whom she supposes to be the gardener. When Jesus says her name, of course, she realizes who it is, and goes to worship him. Jesus tells her, "Don't touch me," all right, but go and tell my disciples. At that point in time, Jesus disappears, but the other women would have come on the scene, all right, and they see the angels. The angels talk to them and give them the command that they need to go back to the disciples and especially to Peter. All the women go back to tell the disciples. On their way back, they do meet Jesus on the way, and at that point in time, they are allowed to worship him and touch his feet. Of course, they go back, tell the disciples, and the disciples do not believe them. All right. Two of the disciples go on the road to Emmaus, and as they're going there, Jesus appears to them, has a good conversation with them for a long time, and then when they stop to eat bread, of course, he prays for that bread. They recognize who he is, and he disappears. They run back, tell the disciples, "We've seen Jesus," and so has Peter. Of course, we mentioned the fact that when the women went back and the disciples didn't believe, all right, Peter did go back to the tomb to investigate. It was very likely that that was the point in time in which Peter saw Jesus. The Apostle Paul tells us that Peter did see Jesus before the other disciples did. And so it's very likely that that happens, all right? So Peter sees Jesus. The guys walking on the road to Emmaus see Jesus. Jesus later appears to 10 of the 11 disciples. And then the following week, of course, Thomas decides to show up to church, and he appears to him as well. And then he appears, of course, to the 7 disciples out fishing. And then later on, of course, Paul tells us he appears to 500, all right? All right, I believe that is a good review for this quiz. I hope you'll study very hard. I'm not going to lie to you, it is a little bit of a tricky quiz, so hope you will study very hard for this quiz. We'll be praying for you. See you on Tuesday.